Hey friends, this is Aubrey from Crybaby Sentimental Homestead, and I want to talk to you about food security and getting your garden ready for next season, for the next spring season and so forth. I'm really concerned about food security as we go into the next year, and um, there's a lot to be said about the supply chain with different natural and also man-made issues happening around the whole world with how we are able to get our food supply, and we have very little control over that. We can see this firsthand in the prices of our groceries and limited availability of certain things. A while back, I heard somebody say that their school had a special meeting about different food items being unavailable. And then I received a message from my own district that said that milk was not going to be available at during school lunches from time to time because of a milk carton shortage. Um, and I kind of in the back of my mind was thinking, I wonder if it really is a milk carton shortage. And if that was the case, why wouldn't they just buy jugs and cups and give students cups of milk instead of cartons of milk? So that excuse doesn't really jive with me. I think it's more than just a milk carton shortage, and I think that there's going to be other shortages coming up very soon. That's something that we should anticipate happening, since there was the culling of so many animals during COVID, when meat processing plants were shut down due to fires, and then also due to workers contracting COVID because of proximity issues and so forth. And they couldn't get the animals um, processed quick enough. And then the farmers had other, new calves and new piglets coming in, and so they were culling or some of the animals to make room. And then there was the whole thing with culling chickens that were not actually sick yet, um, to prevent SARS or to prevent, the avian flu. And so um, it's just totally tragic. I always thought, we are omnivores and we eat animals, and that's something that it has to be part of our food source for the major population. Now, there are people who are vegetarians and vegans, and for the most part, our survival is dependent on multiple different food sources because we are omnivores. And so culling these animals, which were not sick, did not make any sense. Um, there had to have been a better way of it. Then you have all of these, um, issues with not just drought, but labor issues. I mean, if somebody is going to get paid so much money to stay home, I had friends and neighbors saying, why should I even look for a job when I'm getting paid more than my job paid on unemployment? That's ridiculous, because on unemployment, you're supposed to be getting paid less than you normally do. But because of all of the different programs going on, there are so many people getting paid so much more money to stay home, which means some of the harder jobs weren't getting done. So you have this whole supply chain issue, which leads to food shortages that were going to be down the road. And we are expecting them to happen, and they are here. Um, if you look at the expiration dates of a lot of your shelf stable foods at the stores, a lot of them are not years off. It's like these are things that have been, in a warehouse somewhere or something, because um, I remember buying shelf stable foods, and, you know, the projected date was like 5 years from now. And the ones that I'm getting now, I don't see the dates as far as them not being, freshly packaged or so forth. But what I see is that the expirations are not so far in the future. So I think that that little buffer we had, with food that had been stored up already, we are running out of that buffer, and there will be hungry people very soon. People who are not used to being hungry, I should say. There are hungry people already, but there are going to be people who are not used to going to bed without a full belly, who are going to start to feel that the hunger pains. Okay, so you see here on my screen, I'm just perusing Baker Creek. I love their site. They have so many things, and I'm going to tell you a few of my tips for when you're choosing different plants that you're going to try to grow in your garden. Now, yes, having a good pantry is great. Shelf stable foods, the ones that are going to last you 20, 30 years, um, I guess it would be 20, 30 years before you ate them unless you're starving. They're often loaded with sodium. So if you have any kind of issues with um, just like bloating and, inflammation, if you have any inflammatory type of disease, um, living off of that is not ideal. Should you have it? Yes, of course you should. But fresh food is always better. And if you had shelf stable food and you had a really good garden going, you could stretch that food for even longer. Now, I will tell you, it will be very difficult to live off of a backyard garden. Even though, like, I have a large yard and I've been gardening for decades, almost my whole life. And, um, I've just had lots of practice, trial and error. I know like all the right varieties to grow and things that are going to really give you the most food for your buck. If you haven't gardened before, you're really going to want to go for a beginner level garden to start off with. One thing I would caution you is I don't want to hurt anyone's business. And there's nothing wrong with getting those like emergency seed vaults or emergency seed kits. There's nothing wrong with that, but you should temper your expectations. I have in the past purchased those when I was a beginning gardener. I definitely um, picked up some of those items, and then out of curiosity, some years later, I ripped into a few of them. And they often come in Mylar packages, and I would rip them open. And some of those issues are the number of seeds that are included. They'll say it's 1,000 seeds, but it might be 500 of one kind of seed, and then like 10 of this, 5 of this. And one of the issues I found that was actually laughable was that they had like 10 corn seeds, and the corn seeds that they had looked absolutely miserable. They must have been they didn't even tell you what kind of corn. It might say corn, um sweet corn, and it wouldn't even tell you a variety name. And each variety has a different number of days to harvest, slightly different planting, techniques and tips. So that was disappointing. They didn't come with planting instructions. It didn't tell you your spacing, how far apart that should the seeds be, or any other kind of information. For instance, when you plant corn, you should plant them um, as close together as you can, so that the pollination is thorough. If you've ever had a corn cob where you opened it up and it had a bunch of little spot like holes where the kernels were not filled in, That's because all of those little tassels, all those little hairs actually connect to each individual kernel. And the tassels that have the pollen fall onto those fibers, and that's what pollinates. Well, each single one of them has to be pollinated. But if you try to grow your corn in a row like you see in those big cornfields, it won't work because their cornfields are massive. They are growing them tight together because from every direction, the wind, wherever the wind blows, there's going to be pollen falling onto those corn tassels and those corn silks. So, but if you only have 10 corn seeds and you plant them in a row, you're going to have one or two kernels on every cob. And if that. Now you could still use the corn husks as impromptu type, like paper plates. We use them for making tamales, and so forth. And you can use them for all kinds of, the stalks. You could dry them and use them for tinder. You could use them for composting, and things like that is fine. But you really aren't going to get a harvest from that that's going to save your life if you're starving. So, finding an issue that substantial in those seed, emergency seed packets makes me really skeptical. If they could make a mistake that obvious, that I don't think it's worth anything. And I wouldn't think, if they're not going to name the varieties, I'm going to think they're probably subpar. Because if you have a really good variety in there, you're going to want to claim the variety that's listed. So I personally would make my own emergency seed collection. And what I would do is I would just always have a seed, a whole compilation of seeds, varieties of different types. Within each type of seed I want, I'd have different varieties because some are better for, different climates. And even if you have one that's really perfect for your climate might change a little bit, or you might have a really dry year. So having some that are a little bit tolerant to different conditions is a good idea. If you have all of your seeds that were from one shop and that they had low germination rates and that was the only seed packet you had, then I guess you're not having zucchini that year. And maybe never again. Who knows? So I like to go with several different vendors. Baker Creek is one of my favorite. I love Am I Gardener as well. I also sometimes shop from TEOTWAWKI, um, uh, True Leaf, um, several others. Whenever I see somebody, like I will be binge watching on YouTube and they have their own variety and they have an Etsy shop, I will often go on and buy their seeds. But I'm specifically looking, sometimes I do buy hybrid seeds. I really look for heirloom, but sometimes, some hybrids, I'm not saying GMO, I'm saying hybrids, which have been going on for thousands of years. You'd have two parent plants, they breed them together, and they would get an offspring that had the best qualities of both. So then that's a hybrid. And so if you were to take those hybrid seeds and collect those seeds and plant them, you would not necessarily get the best genes of both of those parents again. You might get the worst genes of both of those parents, or you might get predominantly one set of parental genes, that dominated over the other one. So you don't know what you're going to get if you plant the hybrid seeds a second year. Like, so if I planted some kind of hybrid squash, okay, and then I collected seeds from my whatever I yield, and I planted those seeds again, I'm going to get something just random. But the first time I plant them, and if I had 50 seeds and I planted 15 this year and 15 next year and 10 the next year. I'm not talking about that. What I'm saying is the variability would be in their offspring. So there's nothing wrong with hybrids. It just means that you are dependent on a seed vendor, which can be okay as long as seeds are available. So if you love zucchini and you have a hybrid zucchini that you love, go ahead and plant that. But maybe have a pack saved away that's an heirloom variety in case you can't buy your favorite hybrid next year or the year after. Also, I often will save, let's say you have a packet of 50 seeds, I might save, you know, a certain number of those seeds, 10, 15 seeds for the next year in case next year's seeds don't germinate or there's something funky or weird. So a lot of times I'll have 3 to 5 years of seeds from different batches just in case there is a batch of seeds that comes through where they don't germinate or there's something significantly wrong with them genetically. I think as we're going into GMO and all this bioengineering crap, sorry for my language, but that's what it is. It's getting so ridiculous that I think you're going to have to be really, really careful about where you get your seeds. And if you want to keep an heirloom variety going and you want to really ensure the genetic quality and you want to do your own seed saving, which I highly recommend, you would want to do only one type of that plant that would be pollinating at that time. You can stagger your plantings as long as they are not going into pollen and trying to set fruit at the same time, you are okay. So if you stagger those significantly, so like if you started corn and then like if you have a long enough season and 20, 30 days later you start another block of corn, you would probably be okay. I would do the shorter length one first, probably, and I'd try to even plant them in 2 different places if I could possibly help it. So there's just a lot going on in the world, you guys. If you don't have a garden yet, you need to start gardening immediately, and you need to encourage everyone you know to start gardening. If you don't have fruit trees, my recommendation is to get them in the ground yesterday. Um, whenever you see like Costco and Tractor Supply, they start to have fruit trees in the early spring. That's probably the cheapest way for you to get some fruit trees. Um, I have purchased a fruit tree or two from Walmart, and they were the worst. They were the worst. Um, but I'm pretty sure the worst tree I had ended up being the tastiest. It just took like 20 years for it to produce fruit. So, Walmart, the tree I had, I almost gave up on it and I wasn't going to kill it, but I was going to graft onto it. I'm glad I didn't because the fruit is delicious and it's finally fruiting now. But the absolute cheapest way would be to get cuttings. If you can get your hands on some cuttings from a friend or a neighbor, um, or if you could join a group, like there's lots of different Facebook groups where they do plant swaps, they can do cutting swaps. You can buy cuttings. That is still cheaper too. There's a learning curve when you're first starting with cuttings. I would start with the easiest first so you get your bearings. The easiest fruit trees and nut trees to clone. First of all, the first easiest tree to clone would be willow. Anything in the willow family, pussy willow, weeping willow, all of the willows. They actually let off a hormone that increases rooting, and they can be used to help other plants root. So if you're trying your hand at trying to propagate through cloning and cuttings, I would start with willow. If you can't get your hands on willow, I would do figs. They are so easy to root. Elderberry, ridiculously easy to root. They are the easiest. You don't need a degree. You don't need, you know, you don't need to go to some like major effort. You just do your cuttings, like pencil diameter at least. And I would do like 12, 8 to 12 inches. And, you don't even have to scarify them. I almost think that scarifying them or scratching them up on the stem actually damage the areas where roots would have formed. So you don't even have to if you're going to put them in water, and they will produce water roots really quickly. Um, Even better if you can get them directly into soil. I do like to scratch them a little bit um, if I put them in soil. But if you put them in water, I wouldn't even bother with that. If you have a couple of willow sticks to put in there, like fresh willow sticks, that will help them root even faster. You can use rooting hormone, but you don't have to. With figs and elderberry, they are so ridiculously easy. If you have neighbors who have a tree and they're going to do some pruning, before they do the pruning, say, hey, can I have your cuttings? A lot of people will say yes, but then they don't know it has to be fresh. So like, okay, well, I took these cuttings a week ago. They've been sitting out in the front yard in the sunshine. No, you can still try it, but the chances of them rooting go down, 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 as long as they are drying out. So, I had somebody, they charged me $10 for a cutting of their blue elderberry. And she literally just went to the backyard and broke off a dead branch and gave it to me. And I was too embarrassed to, honestly, I was too embarrassed to say anything to her about it because she didn't know what she was doing. Um, so I just took it and I found little pieces at the very tip and the end that looked like there's a little bit of life. So I cut them into two smaller pieces, threw mulched the totally dried out bits, and I checked today and they don't have roots yet, but they have little root nubs. And so I think I might get one or two blue elderberry trees out of that cutting, which is really exciting, especially considering that she literally just broke off a dead branch. And there just happened to be a little bit of life in part of it. So get those fruit trees, nut trees in the ground. Figs and elderberry are the easiest. When you're using elderberry, by the way, elderberry are not really edible raw. You are supposed to process them with heat, like boil them for like 45 minutes to 60 minutes or on high heat, and then you're supposed to strain out the seeds and the skin, and then you use it like an elderberry syrup or a tea, and you can freeze the juice that you get from that, and you have it in pretty small quantities. Don't go overboard. Some people don't realize how medicinal and that not every part of the elderberry is actually edible, so be careful. um Probably one or two wouldn't kill you, and somebody's like, oh yes, I used to eat that. It's like, but you didn't eat it, a handful of it. So be careful. Just like with spinach, if you were to go online like, oh, I'm just going to live off spinach, spinach has oxalic acid, which is not good for you. It's good for the spinach is definitely healthy, but the oxalic acid is not healthy. And so if you were on a starvation diet and you are only eating spinach, you would be very ill. So be careful with the items that you're trying to prep for a long time food security, that you're having balanced food, and that you're really trying to get, all your food groups, you're trying to get carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and protein. It can be difficult to have a really well balanced meal plan when you are living on a plant-based diet. So um, obviously the powers that be are trying to force everyone to live on a plant-based diet. I absolutely love gardening, and I was a vegetarian for 5 years when I was in high school and middle school. um, but the majority of us are not living on a plant-based diet. Changing diets can also be very upsetting to your digestive system. So when you first change your from one kind of diet to another, you can get very sick. You won't feel well. There'll be fatigue. You'll have different, issues with your, bowel movements. And I can't believe I'm saying that in a video. But yes, you can have some drastic changes. If you went from eating Pop Tarts, cereal, sandwiches with bread, and Taco Tuesdays, pizza, and all that stuff, and then all of a sudden you're eating pumpkin soup and stewed tomatoes, and like obviously that's so much healthier, but even that kind of change, you're gonna feel some effects. So well, as you're looking at food security and starting to grow some of your own food, you need to start introducing these things into your diet so you're used to them, and you find out if you have any intolerances. If like if you're gonna try to eat spaghetti squash out of your garden, maybe buy some spaghetti squash from the grocery store and try it ahead of time. See if it's something that you like before you think long term that you're going to live off this. Looking at some of the plants that you see on the screen, you definitely have to have squash. If you think about how the Native Americans survived, there was a lot of lots of different kinds of squash. There's so many different types. There's summer squashes, winter squashes, and there are even some edible gourds. Now, a lot of gourds are not edible, so be careful. But there are so many different choices there. And then there would be lots of beans. Some of them would be like, green beans, but also certain dried beans. Now, be careful because what I'm calling a green bean would be something that you eat. You eat the pod, right? So not all beans have edible pods, and not all edible pods have edible dry beans. So you have to be careful that you read them you read the descriptions. If it says the pods are very tender, well, the pods being tender wouldn't matter unless that's the part that you're eating. I really wish seed companies would start saying, like, what part of the bean can you eat? You can eat the pod and you can eat the beans, and at what point can you eat them? Is it when they're the dry? If you're eating the beans, sometimes like you're gonna eat a pea, are you going to eat it fresh? Are you going to eat it dried? So there are a lot of different things that I wish that they would include. Baker Creek does a great job of telling you the history of it. Emma Gardner does a great job of telling you the logistics of how to grow. So I often would buy a seed packet from Baker Creek and then turn around and buy the same seed packet from Baker Creek and Emma Gardner, because I like his information. It's just super clear. And then I would keep the seed packets. So then I'd have that information on how to grow it in the future. And so that knowledge is key. Doesn't matter how many seeds you get in that little seed vault, that emergency seed stash, if you don't know how to plant it. How far apart should you grow them? Going back to corn, if I'm growing corn, I would plant them 10 inches apart in all directions. So you'll see different spacing. They'll say 8 inches this way, 12 inches that way. Well, you don't probably have a machine that has to navigate through those rows. So you don't have to accommodate some kind of, um, farm equipment. So I would just make it easy, 10 inches apart in all directions. And in between them, you could possibly plant something low growing to the ground. Like I might plant um, something that's really fast. Like maybe you're going to plant some radishes in between them. And then while the corn is still growing, it's pretty short, you can go in every 28 days or every 28, 30 days, and you can harvest your radishes. One year I had a block of corn, and it was a really big block of corn, and along the edge that I could access, I planted beets. And I am so glad I did. I'll tell you what, I planted a golden beet from Baker Creek, and it was so delicious. And it was into the second year. I ate it like an apple. I'm not playing with you. Who eats a beet like an apple? It wasn't all, it wouldn't stain your clothing or your skin because it was a golden beet, so it didn't drip red juice. And it was a little bit on the woody fiber side because it was going into its second year, because beets are biennial. So annual means you harvest it and it's done with its whole life cycle in the one season. Okay, so like you plant um, corn is an annual. So you plant your corn and then you harvest your corn. And when you harvest your corn, if the corn was mature, like a dent or a field corn or a popcorn, you could save some of the seeds. If you're growing sweet corn, that's the milk stage, which means it's immature. You're actually eating it when it's immature. If you let it mature to the point where you could save it for seeds, then it would not be tasty anymore. But so corn is an annual. Okay, it's not going to grow back. But beets are a biennial, which means that, if you harvest them and eat them, obviously they're not going to grow back because you ate them. But if you left one or two in the ground, the following year it would go to flower and seed, and you would get so many seeds, you would not know what to do with all of them. Some of them you would probably miss, and you'd have some random volunteer beets growing in your grass. It's okay. Um, but beet greens are edible too. So you can eat beet greens as like a spinach substitute if you wanted to. They're very, very healthy. They actually, so beets and Swiss chard are the same species. They are, at least they're in the same genus. They will cross pollinate. Um, Swiss chard is basically the same plant, was bred for the leaves, for really healthy, nutritious leaves. So if you were to harvest beet greens, you're not going to have a big beet tuber or a root to eat, but you would have the beet greens. So you could eat a little bit of the greens, and then you'd have a little bit smaller um, root to eat later. But you can eat the greens and you can eat the the root as well. So if you were running out of time at the end of the season and you're like, oh, I don't have enough time to grow for the beet to bulk up in size, well, you can grow it just for the greens. And so you could grow them in succession planting. You could plant some now, plant some a couple weeks from now, and keep doing that all spring, summer, into autumn, into the fall. And that's what I did. And I actually followed Charles Dowding's method, where he would plant like 3 to 5 seeds in a hole. And everybody would say, don't do that, because first of all, beet seeds are actually a fruit that could have more than one seed in there. Every time I've planted a beet seed, I've gotten one beet. I have never gotten 2, 3, 4, 5 beet seeds out of one little tiny seed. So basically, to say that the little seed looks like this little, like, massy, like, blob, and it's kind of rough. But it's supposedly there could be more than one seed inside of that. But my experience has not been that. And usually people, when you plant a seed, unless it was like bunching onions, you plant one hole, one seed, one hole, one seed, one hole, one seed, and you give lots of space. And the theory was, if you plant them far apart, that the beets will have room to expand, which makes total sense, right? But I followed Charles Dowding's advice, and it was put 5 seeds in a hole. And then when they start to they start to like plump up and push against each other, harvest one. And so you'd have like I had this row, and so like every like 10 inches or so, I would have 5 seeds, 10 inches, 5 seeds, 10 inches, 5 seeds. And I harvested like one at a time, and they were beautiful. It worked so well. Whenever you harvested one, it gave them more space to grow, and it was a very efficient use of space. We got a lot of beets out of a very small place. You could have eaten the greens as well as the tubers. Even if something is not as tasty, maybe it tastes better to eat them when their leaves are younger, or it tastes better to eat the tuber when it's younger, and has more fiber if you let it get more mature, but it is still edible. And also, we have chickens, so you can turn those beet greens and leftover pieces that you don't think are very tasty. That could be animal fodder. So then you can keep your chickens alive, and then you have that protein source from the eggs. So it's kind of like a win win. The animals get something delicious too, whatever you don't think is tasty anymore. Be careful, there are some plants that are healthy for people that are not healthy for animals. So you should definitely do your own research. I subscribe to Backyard Chickens online, and I've gotten so much good information over the years. You don't want to feed any alliums, nothing onions, garlic, nothing like that can go to your hens. So be careful when you're feeding them. They do love spaghetti squash. So when I'm feeling like it's your birthday, I go out there, I split open a spaghetti squash, and they'll eat the whole thing, seeds and everything. And they love how stringy it is. They think it's like worms or something. It's not gonna cause issues. Like, you should not give your hens long grasses, because they can get impacted crop. But I don't think there's any problem. Like, do your own research. I don't want someone to get their hen hurt, but my chickens haven't had any problem eating the stringy spaghetti squash. And if I give them grass, I cut it up really short so that they don't get hurt. And I always give them like soft green grass, nothing that's gonna um, cause them to get an impacted crop, which could require them to be put down, or could cause them to die, so, or cause them needless suffering. So don't do that. But so like I didn't put on my list here. You're seeing the screen going by, but you definitely want to get some brassicas. Obviously, I know that broccoli and cauliflower, it's like they don't give you a lot of food in the long run, but if you're eating the cauliflower and the broccoli heads, you can eat the stem, and the leaves are also edible. If you don't love it, you could use it as a cabbage substitute. Chop it up, maybe blanch it or something, freeze it. I'm not so in love with the freezer nowadays because my freezer went out and I had a lot of food perish. Um, but you can feed the broccoli greens and cauliflower greens to your hens if you have a backyard chicken coop. And man, my birds went insane over the cauliflower leaves. They were just so happy. So that was a really good animal fodder for them. And I grew purple of Sicily cauliflower, which was so delicious and so beautiful. If you're going to grow something, you might as well grow something that's really unique that you can't get at the grocery store. Now, that being said, you want to grow food that is prolific. So I will tell you, I am a scientist. I am science minded, but um, I will often experiment and try things that are rare or unique, odd, and things that are really unique and odd and rare. There's probably a reason why they're so rare. It's not necessarily superior, if you know what I'm saying. There's a reason why it didn't become so mainstreamed. Either it's prone to pests, maybe it doesn't taste as good, could be that it doesn't store very well. Well, if we're going into food crisis, you want something that's going to produce maximum yields, have a huge harvest, be very versatile, be tasty still, have good nutritional value, and be shelf stable. So, um, when you are starting this garden now, if you haven't been gardening for a while, I would not go with, the the cave beans. I would not go with something that's the world's smallest pumpkin. I would go with something that's very prolific, that does not need a lot of nutrients in the soil, because that fertilizer is also on a low availability and very, very expensive right now. And I would buy like all the organic type mulches and fertilizers and make my own. Um, if you are relying on synthetic fertilizers, you could get stuck. Not just stuck in the system, paying a lot of money, but what happens if you can't get your fertilizer? You've got your seeds, you've got your very poor soil, and then you're going to put it in the ground and you're going to get very poor yields. So now there are some plants that do well with poor soil, like nasturtiums. Nasturtiums do very well with poor soil. So does purslane, and a lot of weeds like dandelions, chicory, um, plantain. Not the banana type plantain, but the weedy plantain. Anything that grows as a weed in disturbed, poor soils, those are amazing to grow during famine times. Sunchokes are great to grow. Now, I wouldn't pay a fortune for sunchokes. They are not. I grow sunchokes in several different varieties. Um, they have a lot of inulin, and if you're trying to eat a big meal on sunchokes, you're gonna have some major gas, and I'm not sure how, like, calorie wise, it's going to be very low on the calories. But if you double cook it, like you boil it, and then after you boiled it for 15-20 minutes, then you fried it and you ate, the size of like a small potato, then you're going to probably be okay. Maybe take a Beano. Um, and it tastes good with like ketchup and mayonnaise, but like what doesn't, right? Um, it's not going to save your life. Sunchokes are not going to save your life. If you have diabetes, they are high in inulin and low on the glycemic index. So that might be something that you talk to your doctor about. Maybe you want to add sunchokes to your diet. Now, I did show on the screen a couple minutes ago, there is like this like really tiny pumpkin, and that's the reference I was kind of making. Like, I love Bigger Creek's pumpkins, but if you're considering food scarcity, I wouldn't go with the world's cutest little pumpkin. I would go with the meatiest, most delicious, most prolific, smallest hole in the center. Like when you cut open a jack-o'-lantern, it has a giant big hole in there. You don't want that if crap's hitting the fan and you're starving to death. You want something that's meaty and full. And so I would go with one that you see the pictures where there's a big giant seeds in the center. There's very little space in the cavity, and it's very fleshy. I also look for the keywords of a high yielding, prolific, productive, um, good keeper, long storability. Those are words you want to read. You want a pumpkin that can last on the shelf for 12 months. You want an apple that can last on a counter for 4 months, or on a cold space for like 5-6 months. So there are certain types of veg vegetables and so forth that can last a long time. You can get carrots. I would prefer to keep carrots out in the ground outside, um, and just keep them alive, and then just go out and pick them when you need them. And they will get a little bit woody on you, but I think that's better than having a rotten carrot. And so that's what I would do. If you've never tried rutabagas, they are delicious. Roasted rutabagas, all you do is chop them up, put a little bit of oil and salt and pepper on them, and bake them on a baking sheet. I think it was at 350 or 400, I'm not sure. But it was like for like 45 minutes or so until they're a little bit tender. They're better than potatoes, and I don't say that easy. I don't say that easy. Potatoes are my best friend. I love them. I understand how, like, yeah, I can't live without potatoes. But rutabagas, mm, I will say I think they actually are a little bit better. It's like a nutty potato. It's so good. And if you're I wouldn't mess with things that are hard to keep alive. If it's something that's really a princess in the garden and it's like it has to have just the right lighting and just the right fertilizer and just the right spacing and just the right this, and you have to hand pollinate it and then yada yada yada. That's for good times. That's not fun. That's not for famine. That's not for times of you know when we're struggling. Those experiments can be for when you have a bounty already and you don't have any kind of issues going on. Amaranth is interesting because amaranth has edible greens and it has edible seeds. Now, yes, they produce thousands and thousands of seeds, but they are tiny. I don't think in a cold, damp climate like Washington State that I would be able to provide enough grains from amaranth, but it could be a good gray man's crop, if you know what I mean. A lot of people won't recognize amaranth, and look at this leafy variety here. This one's grown for its stems and leaves instead of the seeds, and I don't think a person would see that and think food. I think you could grow that between flowers, and people will think it's an ornamental like a hosta, which hostas are also edible if they haven't been treated with something, and if you know that it's really a hosta, not something different. Um, but yes, I would definitely try to do a little bit of sleuthing, a little bit of sneaky gardening, and see if I can grow some ornamentals that look like flowers, they look like this or that, but that they actually have food value. I think the cat's out of the bag for me because I grow food everywhere. I have like plums, apples, cherries, currants, red currants, black currants, white currants, pink currants, blackberries, tayberries, boysenberries, ground cherries. Like I grow it all. And so anyone who walks past my yard can see how much I have growing. I have my whole back area is all hazelnut trees. And so people are going to know that there's food. Hopefully they'll just grab what they can grab with their hands, which they have done, and it's been irritating. I will be honest. I don't mind sharing, but I was looking forward to eating um my plums, which they eat every single good plum that there was. And then people also grabbed what was it? My red flesh apples. I only got a few red flesh apples. They actually people were coming out and taking the apples and the plums off the trees in my yard. So that was frustrating. So if you do grow a lot of food and stuff hits the fan, people will grab what they can identify as food. So you might want to grow a few things that more than a few things that either they can't identify as food or that maybe like the sunchokes, they grow a tuber. People are going to think it's a sunflower. They're not going to know that there's a root in the ground that they can eat. Maybe you intermix some things. You have some root crops in there um, that people aren't digging up and realizing that it's there. If someone comes through and they see cauliflower and broccoli, they're going to take the cauliflower and the broccoli head off of it. Um, but then they might not take all the leaves and they don't realize that the stalk and the leaves are edible. Same thing like with artichokes. People might take the artichoke flower, the flora at the top, and they might not realize the stem is edible. Um, so definitely grow some things that have some like versatility, that has different parts that are edible, different ways of using it, different stages that you can use it in. Some people might grow something for, the you know, really mature stage, but maybe you can eat it when it's younger, like with zucchini. It's actually tastes better if you eat them when they're smaller, and they will produce more as well. So like if you're growing beans, not all beans are edible in the green bean stage. Um, so if it's not super straightforward, I mean, it has to be straightforward enough that you can identify what your food is. But if it's not straightforward for everybody else, they might not come in and take everything because they won't know what's edible or what's ready. If they see this right here, this crazy thing, they would not even know what to do with it. So, um, yeah, that's something to think about as you're looking through the descriptions. Look for how long it takes to grow, how much space does it take to grow, because if you're growing succession style, you could get 3 or 4 crops in a space. It maybe one thing you might only get one crop in that space. You might also think about interplanting. If something takes a long time to size up while it's growing up, you might plant something that has a very fast turnaround, like I said, radishes. And I don't really like the spicy taste of radishes. My family does, but I have heard that if you cook them, they're not. It does change the flavor profile. So that's something to think if you want to like roast some of radishes and see how that tastes. Daikon radishes are so big. Um, I actually planted some that were supposed to be for sprouting. So, and I wasn't sure what kind of radishes that they were, but I planted a bunch of them and my husband picked them and they were huge. So daikon radishes are really good for loosening up the soil and improving soil quality, getting airflow into the ground. And then you do have that it's such a much it takes longer for them to bulk up and to mature. However, they you get a lot more out of that. And if radishes also are biennial, if you leave a few in the ground, you will have so many seeds. And the seed pods of radishes are edible too. So that's something that you might not realize. Like, I don't really like the pungent, spicy flavor of radishes, but the seed pods for radishes, they actually have a particular type called rat tail radish. And I think Baker Creek has it or had it at some point. Anyway, those actually don't ever get good size roots on them, but they grow more seed pods than average. And those are very good. But any type of radish is going to make a seed pod. So, especially people will say, don't grow radishes in the hot of summer because they will go to seed too fast. Well, that's great if you like the seed pods. So, and I do. I plant radishes all spring, early spring when it's still super cold, all the way to when I get the first frost in the fall. So actually, it's like we've just now had our first light frost. So, you know, um, all the way through that time, you could be getting seed pods. So, maybe plant some, and if they look like they're getting a nice size root on them, eat those, but leave some to get to bolt. And after they've bolted and gone to seed, you get those seed pods off of the rat tail radish, but any radish. Now, everyone has the reason why I said you should grow one variety of each plant is because within the proximity where they can cross-pollinate, I would only have one type of plant of those types. So like I wouldn't have a bunch of different kinds of tomato plants in one area. Because you don't want them to cross-pollinate if you're trying to seed save. And we should be seed
So, I
saving,
mean,
you
looking at
guys.
the Blauhilde
I love to go
beans,
seed
you
shopping. I
definitely
do it all the
can
time. I am a seed
grow
addict.
these or
I
any other
love
ones.
finding new
Choose something
varieties
that
and
you
finding
can
things that
really
are
get to know that type
interesting.
of bean.
But we
I
all need
personally
to
would
find
recommend
the
that you
varieties
grow
that
one
do the best in our
variety of each
climates.
thing.
And
Um,
it's kind of weird, but even if like I want to grow a certain thing, sometimes that thing doesn't want to grow for me. And something else that I maybe didn't really want to grow grows really well for me. We are at the point in our food insecurity that we need to grow what grows well and grows prolifically. And if we don't like how it tastes, we need to figure out how to use it in a recipe that makes it palatable, because we can't afford to have these little pansy crops. And pansy is good because I like pansies and they're really pretty and they also have edible flowers. But we need plants that are going to stand up, that are actually going to germinate well. They're going to be somewhat pest resistant. They're going to be easily pollinated by wind or by, insects. They're not going to require us to hand pollinate them. We need them to be early maturing or early bearing. We need them to be versatile so that we can use them in a variety of ways and that we can use a variety of different things from them. So, like, if we can use the flowers and we can use the fruit and we can use the da 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 da. Okay, so like, for instance, for squash, you can, if you have a lot of times you'll see a bunch of male flowers first. Well, you don't need the male flowers, and they are only helpful if they're setting at the same time as female flowers. So for squash, you can pick the male flowers if there's no female flowers, and you can stuff them and eat them. So you can eat the flowers. You can also eat some varieties of squash are edible at various stages. They're edible when they're immature and then later when they're mature. So when they're immature, they might be used kind of like a zucchini would be or a summer squash, and then later, and that they would not be good storability. You just eat them like as you harvest them. And then later, if you let some of them fully develop and they set, their rinds, they get kind of woody on the outside, very fibrous, then those are going to be much more storable and you would use them differently. Some things might have edible seeds that you can eat. Some plants have every part of it's edible, and that's kind of like a miracle, I think. Um, so the more versatile plants, the better. And it's like even with like looking at beans, you can get a handful of organic beans from a grocery store or a co-op or something or a farmer's market, and you can plant those beans. Well, you know that they're selling those beans um, for cooking them into chilies and soups and that kind of stuff. Well, of course, you can grow them for that purpose. But if you knew what they were, they might have some other purposes too. I like to read up on, like, going through the information on rareseeds.com, going through I Might Gardener, doing like Google searches, finding out, like, is the bean edible as a green bean and also edible as a dry bean? Because if you can get bean varieties that can do both, you won't have to be a scholar and study it and remember everything about it. So if I were you, I would grow a bean variety that's edible at both immature stage as a green bean and then later again as a dry bean. Um, Dry beans also look beautiful as decorations. Put them in a beautiful glass jar. You can save like an old marinara jar or something, rinse it out really good, make sure it's dry. Fill it up with your dry beans. It sits on a shelf. Oh, isn't that cute and pretty? And then the next year you have your seeds. I would never plant every seed in my batch, because what if the next set of seeds didn't germinate? Then you'd have a backup, or you have a new seed vendor and their seeds were contaminated with something. And then you could go backwards and you'd have the seeds from the past that you could grow. So I highly recommend that you do seed saving, and that when you do plant something, you don't plant every single seed in that batch. I often will save just 5 or 10 just to make sure I have that insurance policy. If the next year I grow some seeds and there's an early frost, there's a late frost, there's a pest, or whatever happens, then in your garden, you should also diversify and have some root crops, some stem crops, some leaf crops, some fruiting crops, various levels, like close to the ground, high, bush level, canopy level, get a little bit of that permaculture going on there and diversify there. You can also maximize how much food you get out of a space if you have some of it growing underground, some of it above ground. And then also having flowers and things to bring in pollinators. With the flowers, though, a lot of plants have flowers. It doesn't have to be a strictly ornamental variety. Like even like tomatoes have flowers. If you let your annuals, or if you have biennials, if you let them go to the second year, and you're constantly succession planting, short-term and long-term succession planting, you're going to always have some kind of flowers in your garden that will really encourage pollinators. You want pollinators to be attracted to your backyard. It will increase your yields substantially. And also because we need to encourage them and support them, and so that we don't lose them. Once they're gone, it could be a long time before their populations can recover. So also, I was like showing here, they have lots of different kinds of carrots. Personally, I would not go for these little tiny carrots. You do want some that are going to have like either they have a shorter um, timeline on there, or possibly they grow really large, but maybe you could pick them sooner. Um, and if you didn't pick them, then they would get bigger. So that's a good thing to do. With carrots, also, you can actually eat the leaves. I believe they're very high in calcium, because I remember reading before on one of my pets, I wanted to feed it to my rabbit or my guinea pig, and I read that if you give it to them, they could have issues by having too much calcium. So that's interesting. So you could cut up the carrot greens and add it to a stew or a soup. Um, in addition, so sometimes you pull up a carrot and you're like, this was pathetic. It looks like just like these little strings and hairs. So if that happens, you could chop up the whole thing, from the roots to the top, and then you'd have a little bit more nutrition to add to a soup. Now, peanuts, you probably have to be living down south to grow them. I have tried multiple times growing peanuts. I tried jungle peanuts, which are really pretty, um, and Valencia, but these two varieties are out of stock. But that does remind me, because the black ones are pretty cool, about black garbanzo beans. Black garbanzo beans. I'm going to grow them this year. I have planted garbanzo beans from just regular soup beans, that were not organic or non-GMO. I don't know what they were. I just was like, oh, I'm not sure if these are good anymore. And I planted them and they grew and they produced a crop for me. So, sometimes you grow what you can, and then you just know, I don't know what the genetics are on this, and make sure that you label your stuff really well so you keep things straight. You might have a very, important genetic line that you're trying to. So just important to keep the genetics as clean and pure as we can, but sometimes you're in a bind and you have what you have. If you have a handful of garbanzo beans, that could actually get you, a higher yield by planting them. So, a lot of the things that you have on your shelf, especially if you bought them a while ago, instead of throwing them out, if it has living plant material in there, I would try growing them. Obviously, you can't plant anything that's canned, like canned green beans aren't going to grow. Canned corn isn't going to grow. It's in liquid, so it's not going to grow. But dry beans will likely grow. Okay. And if you freeze like your elderberries, and if you freeze berries, there's a chance that the seeds could grow. In fact, some of them will grow better because they've been cold stratified. But if you freeze, if you freeze your beans, I don't know. I have never tried that, but most things like with the freezing and thawing, water expands. So in many situations that would kill the embryo. I don't, some people actually like to keep their seeds in the freezer, and I don't think that, honestly, I wouldn't do that. I don't keep my seeds in the freezer unless they're supposed to be kept that way. If I'm trying to save some elderberries and I'm going to make elderberry syrup later, I might freeze the berries for that reason, so that I'm buying time. But I'm not trying to keep my seeds in the freezer. When I cold stratify seeds, it's usually in the refrigerator, and it's just for 100 days, and then I plant them. It's not like indefinite. And some of them will start sprouting in the fridge, so you have to keep an eye on them because there's definitely some moisture in there, obviously. So, talking about corn, corn is probably not the best use of space, and I've had so many bad years of corn compared to the few really good years of corn. Um, and when you have a good corn year, you'll know what I'm talking about. We actually had corn coming out of our ears. But no, we actually did. Unfortunately, when I had the big bumper crops of corn, I was pregnant and I was very, very sick, and couldn't even think about eating them. And so my husband gave all the corn away, to relatives and stuff, so that it would at least get used. But we've had really fabulous tomato yields as well, some from year to year. Sometimes you'll get just ridiculous amounts of tomatoes. But tomatoes are much more dependable for us than corn has been. I do like to grow a sweet corn because we just love it so much. But if you're trying to grow something that's going to be shelf stable, you would want to go with a field corn, maybe a dent corn or a popcorn, or yeah. So you want to go with a type that you're going. It's going to say more days on there to harvest, and that's because you are not picking it at the milk stage. You're picking it at the actual stage where it's mature. So when you have um, sweet corn, that's when it says like 70 days on it. You're eating at that point. It's juicy and sweet and delicious, right? But if you wanted to save seeds, you would have needed to let it stay on the plant longer and let it dry out on the actual stalk. Be careful of rodents when you are growing corn. Of all the crops I've ever experienced, corn has been the most attacked by, I will say, I think it's rats, but it could also be squirrels as well, and also insects. So there's a lot of pest and competition in actually getting your corn. I was reading this bloody butcher dent corn description, and it actually says that most bloody butcher dent corn is now cross contaminated with GMO, which is very sad. And they genetically tested this batch and made sure that it is non GMO. So if I was going to buy more Bloody Butcher, I would be buying some more from them. I already have some saved already, but I might buy some more because it's really, really beautiful. I've never grown it before, but I'm really fascinated with it. I'm also really fascinated with Country Gentleman sweet corn. I don't know why, maybe it's the name. Um, I've grown glass gem. One thing they don't tell you is that the ears are really small. So they take up the same amount of space, but they give you a lot less. And the other thing is they're so pretty. I don't want to grind them up and make them into flour. I just want to keep them and save them to plant more for the next year. So when you're trying to grow your edible garden, you do want things that you're willing to grind up and eat. Um, One of my favorite YouTubers, I just really like her. She's a really sweet lady. Robbie from Robbie and Gary Growing. Is it Growing Simple or Growing Easy? Growing made easy or growing made simple. Anyway, Robbie is really sweet, and she always ends by saying, "Don't forget to eat what you grow." And honestly, I'm like, you know what? That's a big deal because how much I've actually let spoil out in the yard because it was so pretty I didn't want to pick it yet. Or, what are you in the mood to eat today? Right? And back in the day, people didn't, really so much think. My mom used to talk about this. When my great grandma was, raising my grandma, she didn't say, "What do you want to eat today, Louise?" She would say, "Here's your food." Like, you ate what you ate, you ate what was available. And they did this disgusting practice um, where they would soak bread in blood and then bake it because they couldn't afford the meat. So they would have a cow and slaughter it and sell the meat, and then the blood they would actually make blood sausage. And I'm not sure if that's what blood sausage is with the bread and the baking of it and so forth, but pretty gross. Um, you ate what you ate. You get what you get. You don't throw a fit. Like, you figure out how you're going to use it. So, as we're growing in our gardens, we need to figure out what are the recipes we can use to use all this zucchini. Like, how many loaves of zucchini bread can you actually make, and how can you eat them? And how long until your neighbors like run you out of town because you keep leaving zucchini on their porch? I don't know. Anyway, zucchini is super good. I love fried zucchini, which of course you'd have to have oil. And I've heard that there is going to be an oil shortage as well. So you have to think of alternatives. Can you, if you don't have as much oil, you could use less. You could brush it on and bake it like you would with like baked JoJo's. Because you're not going to be able to really fry things on the stovetop. You're not going to be able to have a half an inch of oil in your pan. You're going to have to dab it on, blot it on, and make do with whatever you have. And you might not have oils. So, what are you going to do about that? So as you're having your garden, you are thinking carbohydrates, which is not hard to have carbohydrates when you're growing a garden. So you're gonna get your carbs, healthy, very very healthy carbs. You also with carbohydrates, you also need to have fats and protein. Um, with if you're eating beans and rice, then you're getting complete protein, but it's hard to grow rice in all climates. I'm going to be growing um, a land rice or a dry land rice um, just as a like experiment, but it would not be pounds and pounds of it. So it's not something that's going to save a life so much. So growing potatoes is something that could definitely save a life, which I would not buy potatoes online because of how much it will cost you. But you should start growing potatoes and then leave a few in the ground everywhere you can. And in my climate, which is zone 8 in the Pacific Northwest, potatoes overwinter and will come up by themselves the next year. So I will grow a variety of different kinds of potatoes. I've grown red flesh varieties, red skin varieties, white, yellow, blue, purple, and so forth. I've have all different kinds of named varieties, but basically you don't want to have just one type because if they were to have an issue, they would all be susceptible to the same types of issues. Um, it's also good practice if you can to plant it in different soil the next year so you can prevent blight. So, like, if I'm harvesting all my potatoes and I take one of them and I put them in a new fresh pot for the next year, I will call that good. And then I just don't keep using the same soil over and over and over again. We don't want a repeat of the potato famine, the Irish potato famine, which was, they didn't have access to a lot of food. They were cut off from their trade routes. Um, and then they had blight. So it was like it just compounded the situation that they were already having hard times. And we're already having hard times, so we don't need to compound the situation. But if I was also looking, and in Russia, many years ago, I was looking and it said that most people have a second property or another place where they kind of live sometimes, and they have a garden. So they might like live in town in the city when they're working during the week, and then on the weekends they go somewhere else. So I'm not sure if this is a rumor, but I saw like lots and lots and lots of videos, and they would show like the entire yard was potatoes. It was rows and rows and rows and of these mounds of potatoes. And I saw some harvests. They were ridiculous. They had so much food. Um, and it was from, I'd say, like a typical backyard size area. So if people really got serious, that could be life saving. The bad thing is, if you're not being careful, I've heard that the spores from potato blight can travel 40 miles on the air, on the wind. So that would be serious if somebody was really lazy and let blight manifest and go crazy. Then it could ruin it for many counties in the area of a state. So like um, 3 or 4 counties could be affected by one person who's negligent in their garden. That's kind of scary to think about. So you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. Don't just grow potatoes. I would be growing potatoes, turnips, rutabagas, carrots, onions, and growing. I don't know how, but growing onions and other alliums does seem to increase the health of your garden overall in many ways. They help deter pests. Um, they help, like when you're actually, making your recipes. They have all kinds of medicinal properties that you don't really think about. Um, so you also want to consider what you like to eat. So when we first started gardening, we had a salsa garden when we started gardening outside. When I lived in an apartment, I just had like cactus. I had lots and lots of them. They had lots of baby cacti everywhere. But when I first got married, we were growing a salsa garden, and we had cilantro, and we had different kinds of peppers and tomatoes and all that. And we could make our own salsas and sauces and dips and um, like spaghetti sauce and all that kind of stuff from our garden. And then over the years, we just got expanded more and more and more and more. And so it's pretty cool. Like every once in a while, I'll think like, yeah, we don't have enough yield at this point to sustain our whole family. But I think if a person in my backyard, it could probably sustain one person for the entire summer. And that I think that's huge. If everyone's backyard could sustain the nutritional needs of one person for 3 months, that is huge. That would take a lot of burden off of our food supply. And even if it's 30% of what your family eats, if you're mixing all this stuff with rice, if you're mixing all this stuff with your startup dry noodles, if you're mixing this stuff up with, your 30-year shelf life foods, you're going to be adding so much nutritional value, and you're not going to get that fatigue from food that you get like when you're dieting, because if it's a food shortage, it will be a forced diet, and you may be very unsatisfied. So in this background, as I've been talking, I would have been buying some sweet corn, some dent corn, not planting them by each other because I don't want them to cross. I'd be buying some cherry tomatoes. I will tell you, Green Doctors is not my favorite flavor, but it was the most abundant tomato harvest I've ever had. There were so many tomatoes. So, cherry tomatoes, some kind of spicy pepper. I plant it in a pot so you could take them in the wintertime and have peppers for many years. I have peppers growing in my classroom. I just took the whole giant pot and back into my room and they're still producing. I have them, they're like 2 or 3 years old now. Ground cherries are very good. They're like a tomato, pineapple had a baby. They're only edible when they're yellow. So if you pick them and they're green, they're toxic. You have to let them ripen and they'll fall off in that little paper husk. Um, but I'd also be growing rutabagas, turnips, different kinds of radishes, like daikon radishes for sure. You can eat the radish seed pods. I would grow all different kinds of brassicas. The higher yielding, the better. Beets are amazing. I definitely grow golden beets and any other kind of beet I can get my hands on, but definitely the golden beet. Sugar beets, if you want to make some rudimentary sugar. Most of the sugar in the United States is made from sugar beets, not sugar cane. So I do plan on making sugar from sugar beets in the future as an experiment. And if I do, I will, or when I do, I will make a video and show you how I do that. And whatever issues, snafus I run into, I will always like to warn you of what to avoid. And I usually figure that out the hard way. Definitely grow pumpkins and different kinds of squashes. You want summer squashes and winter squashes. There are 3 or 4 or 5 main species of squash. If you were to grow one of each of the species, you wouldn't have the cross pollination issue. Like if a maxima and a pepo, if that's how you say it. A machado. If you just grow one of each of those, you could grow 3 different varieties, and they could be in the same proximity to each other, but they'd have to be in the different species. So, um, if you look at the actual scientific name, that will be very helpful. That way, you don't get cross pollination. I would grow potatoes, which you can buy actual true seeds and I've actually saved true seeds, but I haven't gotten around to planting them. You do plant the tubers. Sweet potatoes in Washington State are not really realistic. You can grow them for the greens. I would grow Malabar spinach, New Zealand spinach, Swiss chard, which is a type of beet, so I would not grow them next to my beets. Kales, all kinds of stuff like that. Lettuce, I would not really grow, and I will grow this year, but I wouldn't grow it to save my life, so to speak. If you can't cook it, you can't sanitize it. So if I was having any kind of pest issue or, bacteria or something, um, people don't really cook their lettuce. So I would probably go for collard greens and kales and things like that and cabbages um, and so forth. So you could go online and you could spend $10, get a couple packs of seeds, get a free seed packet, free shipping and handling from rareseeds.com, and do this once a month or once every other week, and eventually get up to a really good, substantial seed collection. And make sure that you use your seeds, don't let them die. This is a resource that's going to be in limited worldwide, so don't waste your seeds. You don't let them die, don't let them expire. Make sure you plant them. This is something that everybody needs to do. God bless you all. Live long and prosper. Please help protect our food security. There's only one way to do it, and it takes all of us working together to make sure that we don't starve to death and our neighbors don't starve to death. And we're going to have to take this into our own hands at this point. Clearly, there are nefarious things happening. Multi-billionaires should not own all the farmlands with the intent to not farm. So how are we going to feed everybody? We're going to have to grow our own food. We're going to need to use every square inch that we have available. You might even want to start thinking about um, starting sprouting and microgreens inside your home. If you live in an apartment, that might be the best way to, work on food security. If you are able to grow your own sprouts inside, a few potted plants outside, get some tomatoes growing. Um, that's going to be huge. Maybe do a few uh, columnar apple trees on your patio. That would be very smart. You could do some. I always am unsure of how to say it, um, but you can train your trees to be the size you want them to be, the shape that you want to be that have them in, and make them fit the space that you have available to you. You can grow vertically if you don't have a lot of ground space. There are a lot of ways to make this happen, but we really, really, really need to stop relying on the government and millionaires, billionaires to save us. We're going to have to learn how to save ourselves. And if we care about what's in our food, we're going to have to grow it ourselves. Because you're reading a label. I looked at 2 different boxes of crackers. One said bioengineered and one didn't. I don't know if the one that didn't say it is not bioengineered or if they just haven't caught up with labeling their products yet. So if you want to know what's in your food, you're going to have to make it yourself from the raw ingredients that you grow in your own backyard. God bless you. I'll see you on the next video. Live long and prosper. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Comment below if you have a favorite seed variety that you want to shout out to. Let us know what's your very um, favorite plant to grow in your garden that you think would be beneficial in maintaining food security moving forward. See you next time. Bye-bye.